You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to tell you was buried, hidden, sealed in dust and silence for more than 2 centuries. In 1987, deep within the Virginia State Archives, a locked chest was opened. Inside were 23 witness testimonies, 14 coroner reports, and 1 blood-stained journal. The handwriting was jagged, the ink blurred by time, but the name scrawled across its cover sent a chill through every historian who dared to touch it. Kate Bender. The year was 1801 in Henrico County, Virginia, a year when the South trembled with rebellion and the forests became more dangerous than any battlefield. For in those forests stalked a woman, 6 feet tall, shoulders like a man, eyes like pale winter glass, and she hunted not animals, but people. Escaped slaves who thought freedom lay to the north. Her journal detailed a season of hunting that never ended. 37 lives in 18 months, each kill methodical, calculated, and ritualistic. She called it vengeance, others called it madness, and the authorities, terrified of what the truth would do to the fragile social order, buried her story. Tonight, you'll unearth what they buried, but understand this: once you know it, you cannot unknow it. Richmond, Virginia, 1801. Still shaking from Gabriel Prosser's failed slave rebellion the year before. A rebellion betrayed, crushed, and silenced with executions and heads mounted on pikes. But the fear it left behind spread like a plague. Plantation owners slept with muskets by their beds, overseers doubled their patrols, and in the forests, a new predator emerged. Her name was Catherine Elizabeth Hartwell, Kate Bender, after marriage. Born to poor tenant farmers, she grew up hard, brutalized by the land and hardened by poverty. Witnesses described her as more beast than woman. She bent iron horseshoes with her hands. She could crack walnuts between her fingers. Her grey eyes never looked at you, only through you, as if calculating when to strike. By the time she married Thomas Bender, a notorious overseer, Kate had already learned the power of violence. Their plantation became a place whispered about, even among slaves, where punishment wasn't just cruelty, it was theater. Neighbors reported screams that carried through the pine forests at night, and when Thomas died, his skull crushed during a failed manhunt, Kate did not weep. She transformed. The widow became the hunter, and in her grief she discovered the power of blood. Kate's first kill came in March of 1801. His name was Samuel, a young man who had fled 40 miles south, following the river north in search of freedom. His body was discovered a week later, hanging from a massive oak tree just 2 miles from the Bender plantation. His hands were bound. His throat bore the marks of strangulation long before the rope took his final breath. The coroner called it suicide, an explanation so absurd that even his own deputies doubted it. But in 1801, no one wanted the truth. To acknowledge murder meant acknowledging that a white woman had taken justice into her own hands, and the plantation order depended on silence. Yet the pattern began. Kate had studied the routes of runaways like a naturalist studies prey. She knew fugitives followed rivers for water and concealment. She knew their desperate choices, their hiding places. She scouted them with a hunter's patience. And when they rested, when they believed for a moment they were safe, she struck. Her journal describes it not as murder, but as correction, a word she underlined twice. To her, the hunted weren't human. They were trespassers in a game only she controlled. By the summer of 1801, whispers spread through Henrico County that something unnatural stalked the woods. Bodies began to surface in places only locals knew: swamps, riverbeds, shallow graves beneath pine roots. But these weren't simple killings, they were staged. Witnesses recalled corpses tied in poses, bound with rope or leather, positioned like warnings. One woman was found in an abandoned barn, her arms stretched wide as though crucified, her chest carved with patterns no one could explain. Another, a boy barely 17, was discovered face down in the mud, his spine broken, his mouth stuffed with pine needles. These details never reached official records. Instead, constables marked them as drownings, accidents, or acts of God. But Kate's journal told the truth. She described her arrangements as offerings, punishments carried out in silence because the law was too weak, and she admitted to something darker, that each death gave her strength, as if the very act of extinguishing life hardened her body and sharpened her mind. The more she killed, the less she resembled the grieving widow, and the more she became something primal. She was no longer simply avenging Thomas, she was refining the art of fear itself. Kate soon realized her power wasn't in killing alone, it was in being talked about. By autumn, every plantation within 20 miles whispered of the grey-eyed widow who haunted the woods. Runaways spoke of a giant woman moving silently through the trees, her shadow falling over them like a storm. Some said she carried an oak club, others swore she strangled with her bare hands. The stories contradicted, but the fear was the same. And Kate encouraged it. She left bodies where they would be found, staged like theatre for the living. She carved crude symbols into bark near the sites, circles crossed by lines, marks no one could decipher, but everyone feared. Slaves whispered she was not a woman at all, but a demon summoned by masters to keep them enslaved. Overseers privately feared she might be more than human. How else could she hunt entire groups and vanish without trace? In her journal, Kate reveled in this. She wrote, "Fear multiplies faster than blood. One body makes 100 tremble." She wasn't just hunting flesh anymore. She was hunting minds, reshaping reality itself. And in a world already choking on paranoia, her legend became as lethal as her hands. The failed rebellion of Gabriel Prosser in 1800 had left Virginia in a state of raw hysteria. Dozens of slaves had been executed, their heads displayed on pikes as warnings, yet the fear of another uprising gnawed at every planter's mind. Into this atmosphere stepped Kate Bender, though not as a protector of the order, but as something far stranger. Her killings, while never officially acknowledged, became convenient. Every runaway found dead was another reason to tighten chains, to pass harsher laws, to justify violence in the name of security. Some whispered that Kate was being quietly tolerated by the very system she terrified. A tool too dangerous to name, but too useful to destroy. Plantation owners could not publicly endorse her, but they did nothing to stop her, and Kate knew it. In her journal she wrote, "They hate me, but I serve them. I take from them what they cannot take themselves. They pretend to curse me, but they drink my work like wine." She had become a shadow enforcer, operating outside the law, yet reinforcing it by terror. And in this twisted partnership, her power grew, not sanctioned, not condemned, but allowed to feed on blood unchecked. She taught herself to wait. The hunts evolved from chance ambushes into seasons, carefully timed campaigns when the river froze, when fog clung to the hollows, when men's eyes were glazed with drink after market day. Kate mapped the county like a general studies terrain. She learned which families sheltered runaways, which fields had loose dogs, which barns smelled of candle smoke and clandestine coffee pot meetings. Then she struck in patterns that people could not ignore. Not random, predictable. The predictability was the point. Year after year, bodies appeared along the same bends, beneath the same knotted oak, in the same abandoned smokehouse. The markers, carved bark, braided rope, the odd strip of cloth, became a language. To the terrified, it spelled inevitability. To the masters, it whispered order. To the hunted, it screamed doom. Kate refined methods that blurred the line between execution and message. Staged scenes that humiliated, bindings that mimicked ritual, wounds arranged so the living would know the price of defiance. Each season she returned more efficient, less human. Her journal grew colder. Entries that once scrawled grief became terse inventories, names, routes, times. She kept trophies not of violence, but of mastery, a cuff, a scrap of hem, a dog's clipped ear. And as rumor hardened into legend, no one could say where Kate ended and Henrico's fear began. By 1815, Kate's legend had outgrown her flesh. Neighbors swore they saw her in 2 places at once, at a creek bed 10 miles east, and on a ridge at sundown the same night. Some claimed she whistled like a bird to lure fugitives, others that her shadow moved ahead of her, larger than her body, warning those who were too late to run. The superstitions fed her aura. Slave children were warned, "Sleep light, or the widow will take you." Overseers muttered about her at night fires, pretending to joke, but clutching their pistols tighter. The few who had glimpsed her swore her face no longer looked fully human, eyes too bright, jaw too fixed, something monstrous in the stillness of her movements. And perhaps the most disturbing detail, she never stopped writing. The journal thickened into volumes, each page a cold scripture of names, dates, and cryptic symbols. She wasn't killing for survival anymore. She was archiving her dominion, documenting herself as though she knew one day her terror would outlive her. And in a way, it did. For every whisper of rebellion that stirred in Virginia soil, there was always a counter-whisper. Kate is out there. Kate is watching. The first attempt to end her came in the spring of 1817. A posse of 6 men, planters, an overseer, and 2 bounty hunters, rode out with rifles, hounds, and whiskey courage. They spoke loud of honor, of cleansing the county of its shame, but underneath their bravado pulsed another fear. If they did not act, the story of Kate would soon eclipse their authority. They tracked her into the lowland swamps where the cypress roots twisted like skeletal hands. By dusk, the hounds had gone silent. By nightfall, the men began hearing sounds they could not place, branches snapping where no weight should be, a whistle like wind, though the air was still, the faint thud of something heavy striking water. They pressed on until one vanished. No gunfire, no cry, only a gap where a man had stood, then another. When at last 2 survivors staggered back to civilization, mud-caked and hollow-eyed, they spoke only of eyes in the dark and a strength that ripped through flesh like cloth. They swore Kate was not alone, that something larger moved with her, though they could never describe it fully. And from that day, no posse formed again. Kate had hunted the hunters. The county understood. She was not to be pursued. After the swamp massacre, a silence spread through Henrico. No one spoke Kate's name in public, yet her shadow governed private decisions. Families locked doors earlier, travelers avoided certain roads after dusk, and plantation owners, who should have united to destroy her, began weaving her into their unspoken order. She became an invisible clause in the social contract: keep quiet, stay loyal, and the widow hunts elsewhere. Runaways began to hesitate, not only because of dogs and chains, but because Kate was worse than both. She was personal, inevitable. Mothers hushed restless children with her legend. Overseers invoked her to terrify workers into obedience. And curiously, the authorities never pursued her. No sheriffs organized raids. No courts posted warrants. It was as if Kate existed outside the written law, tolerated as a phantom enforcer. Perhaps they feared what would surface if they put her on trial. Perhaps they needed her chaos to keep order. In her journals she gloated, "The silence is my shield. They pray I am myth, yet build their lives around my truth. I have become law without name." She was no longer just a woman of blood. She was an institution of fear, half human, half necessary evil. By the 1820s, Kate's violence no longer looked like random slaughter. It began to resemble ritual. Bodies were found in threes, posed in triangular patterns. Trees bore notches and crosscuts that formed crude glyphs, repeated across years like a language only she understood. Superstitious slaves whispered that Kate left offerings to something darker, that the woods themselves had become her altar. Even planters, hardened men who scoffed at folk tales, began to recognize the rhythm. Each season carried its own signature of death, as if the killings were tethered to the calendar itself. Harvest brought strangulations, winter drownings, spring dismemberments, summer hangings. The pattern was too exact to ignore, and yet no one dared to call it what it looked like, a liturgy in blood. Some swore that when the symbols were freshly carved, birds went silent in those groves. Hunters spoke of finding deer gutted with surgical precision, left untouched by scavengers. Kate was no longer seen as merely a woman. She had blurred into the role of priestess, conducting rites in a church without walls, sanctified by fear. Her journal during this period grew stranger too. Passages no longer listed names, but repeated numbers, diagrams, incantations, words that looked less like confession and more like doctrine. Whispers began to surface that Kate's journals were not all buried in her shack or rotting in the swamps. Pages, torn, traded, stolen, circulated quietly among men of influence. A planter in Richmond was rumored to own a volume bound in deerskin, filled with her strange glyphs and numbers. A magistrate's nephew boasted he had glimpsed a passage describing the geometry of fear. Some claimed Kate herself leaked them, leaving pages tucked into hollow logs, folded inside the pockets of the dead. Others believed powerful men preserved her writings deliberately, as if her methods contained a system too valuable to lose. The journals were no longer seen as the ravings of a mad woman, but as scripture of control, blueprints for bending minds without chains. By 1825, there were whispers of slave patrol captains invoking her symbols before their rounds, of overseers etching her marks on barn doors to terrify workers into submission. If true, Kate's influence had crossed a boundary. She was no longer simply killing. She was seeding an ideology, embedding herself into the very architecture of fear. And though no one would admit it publicly, some men of power were not trying to destroy Kate Bender. They were learning from her. By the late 1820s, sightings of Kate became less frequent, but the killings did not stop. This birthed a darker suspicion. She was no longer working alone. In distant counties, bodies turned up bearing her same signatures, triangular arrangements, carved symbols, seasonal rhythms. Though no one had seen her there, could Kate have disciples? Some believed she had begun teaching select runaways, not to free them, but to twist them, molding them into shadows of herself. Others whispered she seduced drifters, men without allegiance, then broke them down through ritual and violence until they mirrored her will. The journals hinted at this evolution. References to the circle, to those who carry my mark. In one fragment she wrote, "A lone flame dies in the wind. Many flames remake the night." The idea chilled the countryside. If true, then Kate's terror was not bound to her body. It was transferable, infectious. Even her silence became strategic, because absence only magnified the paranoia. Was she still out there, or was it someone else wearing her methods? No one could answer. What they knew was worse. Kate Bender was no longer merely a widow with blood on her hands. She was becoming a tradition. By the 1830s, the line between Kate Bender and the system itself had dissolved. Her myth was no longer just whispered, it was deployed. Planters invoked her name when punishing slaves, warning that the widow of the woods would finish what they started. Overseers carved her symbols on posts, not because they feared her, but because others did. The Virginia legislature passed harsher slave codes after rumors of another uprising, and though Kate's name was never written into law, her shadow lingered behind every clause. Fear had become institutionalized, and Kate's legend was its sharpest instrument. What made it worse was the secrecy. Newspapers never printed her story. Officials never acknowledged her existence. To speak of Kate publicly was to break the spell. Instead, she thrived in silence, a phantom woven into policy and punishment. She had become the perfect ghost, visible only where fear already lived, useful because she could never be proven, and powerful because she could never be disproven. In her final surviving journal entry, scrawled in a shaking hand, she wrote, "They will not bury me, they will wear me." Whether she meant her killers, her symbols, or her doctrine, no one could say. But history suggests she was right. By 1836, Kate Bender vanished. No burial, no trial, no gallows. She simply slipped from the record. Some claimed she drowned in the James River, dragged under by the very waters where she had staged her rituals. Others swore she fled west, joining wagon trains, carrying her doctrine into the frontier. There were darker rumors still, that the elites who had quietly benefited from her terror finally silenced her, not with a bullet, but with secrecy, erasing her to preserve the usefulness of her legend. Yet the killings, or something like them, continued for years after. Runaways still disappeared along familiar routes, symbols still appeared carved into bark, hunters still whispered of shadows moving where no one should be. The absence of a body ensured one thing: Kate was never truly gone. In the minds of the enslaved, she remained the widow who stalked them. In the whispers of overseers, she was the reminder of what happens to the disobedient. And in the silence of the powerful, she lingered as an uncredited partner in control. By vanishing without closure, Kate had achieved what no gallows could take from her. She had become eternal, a story that could never be killed. Kate Bender's name never entered the official histories of Virginia. No courthouse record, no epitaph, no mention in the ledgers of justice. And yet, she persists. Her story survives in fragments, whispers, and the invisible marks she left on human behavior. Fear, once planted, does not die, it mutates. The silence surrounding her became its own kind of scripture, passed down not by books, but by caution, by memory, by the sick instinct that some evils are allowed to endure because they serve hidden masters. Even now, scholars stumble upon strange journal fragments in estate sales, plantation ruins, or sealed trunks, pages filled with her impossible symbols. The language is undeciphered, but the message is clear. Kate meant to be remembered, not as a woman, but as a force. And maybe she succeeded. For in every story of the Night Stalker, every legend of the grey-eyed phantom, every warning whispered to keep the disobedient in line, a shadow of her still walks. She was not erased. She was planted, deep in the soil of America's hidden history. And when you hear a sound in the woods, sharp and sudden, when you feel eyes on your back though none are there, remember, some seeds never stop growing.